So I want you to imagine for a second that you've just spent the equivalent of about $8,000 on a brand new cutting-edge portable computer.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a serious investment.
Right, a huge investment. So you proudly carry this sleek, futuristic marvel out of the electronics store. You set it down on a cafe table to show it off. You flip the power switch, and absolutely nothing happens.
Nothing at all. Just a dead screen.
Exactly, a dead screen.
Yeah.
Frantically check the back, and that is when you realize the horrifying truth. Your brand new $8,000 portable computer doesn't actually have a battery.
Which is just wild to think about.
If you want to use it, you literally have to go find a wall outlet.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of realization that would instantly result in a refund today, right? You'd march right back to the store.
Oh, absolutely.
But, you know, in the landscape of 1980s computing, this wasn't actually a defect. It was a calculated, albeit deeply compromised engineering decision.
Yeah, and today we are tearing into that exact machine. Welcome to our deep dive on the ACT Apricot Portable. We're stepping back into November 1984, and this machine is hitting the market, promising, like a veritable sci-fi utopia to buyers.
It really was sold as the future.
Right, it's got this futuristic flat liquid crystal display, an invisible infrared wireless keyboard, and genuine built-in voice recognition. But when you look past the glossy marketing brochure, you find a machine that just hilariously tripped over its own power cord.
Totally.
And to guide us through this magnificent failure of a computer, we are looking at an incredibly grounded, deeply frustrated review from Personal Computer World magazine, which was written by tech journalist Peter Bright.
Yeah, and what's great is Bright actually had his hands on a pre-production model, which gives us this wonderful, unvarnished look at a machine right before the marketing spin takes over completely.
Right, the raw truth of it.
Exactly. He's writing for an audience that really understands hardware, you know, which means he doesn't just list the features, he tears them apart to see if they actually survive contact with reality.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
Right.
Because before we can even get to the voice recognition or the, invisible infrared lasers, we have to talk about the physical box itself.
The sheer size of the thing.
Yeah. The Apricot Portable measures 450 millimeters wide, 172 millimeters deep, and 200 millimeters high. So for you listening, try to picture something a bit thicker than an average paperback book, but stretched out to be about 1.5 feet wide.
Right, so it's definitely too big to balance on your lap.
Yeah, far too big. But it is substantially smaller than those massive desktop towers or even those weird sewing machine-sized luggable computers of that era.
Which, to be fair, was a massive achievement for the time. I mean, ACT was trying to cram genuine 16-bit desktop computing power into a chassis you could actually tuck under your arm.
And under the hood, they were using an Intel 8086 processor, right?
Yeah.
Clocked at 5 megahertz.
Yep, 5 megahertz. And that specific clock speed is an interesting departure, really, considering their previous desktop machine. The F1 ran at a slightly slower 4.77 megahertz.
Oh, which was the standard set by the original IBM PC, right?
Exactly. So they're pushing for just a little more speed in this portable unit.
Right. And looking at the storage, you had a Sony 3.5-inch 720K double-sided floppy disk drive hiding over on the right panel.
A very solid drive for the era.
It was. But the thing that immediately jumps out at me when reading Bright's teardown isn't the processor or the drive, it's the memory. In 1984, RAM was incredibly expensive.
Oh, astronomically expensive.
Right, so to get the 256 kilobytes of onboard memory into this machine, ACT literally soldered 32 individual Texas Instruments RAM chips directly onto the main board.
Which is just crazy to picture.
Right, just a sprawling grid of black silicon squares.
Yeah.
And each one only holding 64 kilobits. That tells me they were desperate to hit a specific price point using a bulk supply of cheaper or lower density parts rather than using fewer, more efficient chips.
Well, yeah, and that is exactly what the supply chain dictated in 1984. You couldn't just source high-density memory modules off the shelf economically. You had to buy what was being produced at volume.
Right, whatever you could get your hands on cheaply.
Exactly, and all those individual chips take up a massive amount of physical real estate on the printed circuit board. Plus, it severely limits your upgrade path as a user.
Yeah, because Bright notes that the board was technically wired to accept larger 128K chips, meaning the machine could theoretically max out at 512K of RAM.
Right, theoretically.
But you couldn't actually upgrade it yourself. It was strictly a factory option.
Yep.
So you had to commit to the upgrade at the very moment of purchase, essentially trying to predict your computing needs years in advance, which honestly feels remarkably similar to the closed ecosystem, unified memory approach we see in modern laptops today.
Oh, history definitely repeats itself when it comes to hardware lock-in, for sure. But, the most shocking discovery Bright makes when he opens up the case isn't actually what's on the motherboard. It's what is entirely absent from the motherboard. There isn't a single CMOS chip inside the entire machine.
Which brings us right back to the lack of a battery.
Exactly.
So for anyone listening who isn't a vintage hardware engineer, explain the mechanism here. Why does missing out on CMOS technology suddenly tether a portable computer to the wall?
It really comes down to the fundamental physics of how microchips handle electrical current. So CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor.
Okay.
In older transistor logic families, like the NMOS chips that ACT was actually using in this machine, the circuits constantly leak a small amount of electrical current.
So they're just bleeding power.
Yes, constantly, which generates heat and drains power continuously, even when they aren't actively calculating anything. CMOS technology, on the other hand, is brilliant because it uses pairs of transistors configured so that they only draw significant power at the exact microsecond they switch from a 1 to a 0.
Oh, wow.
Right. So the rest of the time, their power draw is essentially 0.
Okay, so no CNOS means the Apricot Portable is just constantly chugging electricity, burning through power, whether you are typing a novel or literally just staring at a blinking cursor.
Precisely. ACT made a calculated and honestly brutal compromise. CMOS chips in 1984 were incredibly slow to manufacture and extremely expensive.
So they just cut them to save cash.
Basically, yeah. ACT deemed the technology too costly to be viable for the portable market at the specific price point they wanted to hit. They chose cheaper, power-hungry chips. And the physical consequence of that is that a battery capable of running this machine for even, like, an hour would have made the computer far too heavy to lift.
Right, you need a car battery.
Pretty much. So they just abandoned the battery entirely. It is strictly mains-powered.
So they essentially built a desktop computer, slapped a handle on it, and marketed the handle.
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
Yeah. It's like calling a refrigerator portable just because you put it on a dolly. I mean, sure, you can physically move it from the kitchen to the garage, but the second you do, it stops working until you find another wall plug to keep the milk cold.
I mean, it's a funny analogy, but I wouldn't call it completely absurd for 1984. You have to remember that bringing 16-bit processing power home at all was considered kind of a miracle, even if it had to be plugged in.
Yeah, that's true.
The definition of portable back then was just vastly different. It generally meant transportable.
Right.
It meant you could pack it up, put it in the trunk of your car, drive to a hotel, and plug it in at a desk there, rather than being confined to one single room in your office building forever.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But the sheer amount of power those non-CMOS chips were drawing created a huge secondary problem, didn't it?
Oh, definitely.
Because when Bright removes a large cover on the back of the machine, he finds what he calls and I love this quote, a massive great heat sink.
Yeah, a massive great heat sink.
Just a giant, heavy block of finned metal whose only job is to radiate the immense heat generated by the motherboard away from the plastic casing, on a machine where weight and size are supposed to be the main selling points.
It is the ultimate paradox of early microcomputing. They desperately wanted the power of a desktop, but they couldn't afford the thermal efficiency of modern components, so they basically just strapped a radiator to the back of the machine.
It's wild.
But, to ACT's credit, they recognized that if you were forced to sit at a desk near a wall socket, they at least needed to provide a display that felt revolutionary. They couldn't cut the power cord, but they tried to shrink the screen.
And shrink it they did. I mean, when you look at pictures of the Apricot Portable, the display completely dominates the front of the unit. We aren't talking about a heavy, bulky cathode ray tube monitor. There's a 25-line, 80-column liquid crystal display, an LCD.
And Peter Bright highlights just how bleeding edge this really was. As far as he was aware, this was the first production machine ever to ship with a full 25-line LCD.
Really, the very first.
That's what he believed, yeah. The raw display panel was manufactured in Japan by Hitachi. But what is really fascinating is that ACT looked at Hitachi's stock display controller, which is the chip that tells the LCD what pixels to turn on and off, and decided it just wasn't fast enough.
Huh. So what did they do?
ACT's engineers custom designed their own highly optimized display controller chip just to drive this specific screen.
Which resulted in some pretty impressive specs for the time, honestly. In graphics mode, it pushed out 640 by 200
Wow,
pixels.
very crisp for 1984.
But the length they went to physically fit this technology into the chassis are just hilarious to me. Bright actually opened up his pre-production review unit, right? And he found an old Serious and Computer Guarantee card just physically shoved between two of the internal circuit boards.
Yeah, because the boards were packed so tightly together, they were at risk of physically touching and shorting out the entire machine.
It's literally like using a folded-up matchbook to level out a wobbly table at a restaurant. Except if this table wobbles, it instantly fries a 1,600-pound motherboard.
It really is. It is such a wonderfully chaotic glimpse into 1980s hardware prototyping.
Just shoving cardboard in there.
Exactly. But when Bright looks past the cardboard warranty card, he examines the printed circuit board mounted directly behind the LCD, and he notes it utilizes 20 unique flat-pack decode chips.
Okay, flat-pack chips.
Yeah, these were advanced square chips with connector pins on all four sides, specifically designed for high-density, space-saving layouts. So ACT was throwing immense engineering effort at making this flat screen work.
Okay, so they achieved this engineering marvel. They have a super thin, relatively high-resolution LCD display that saves immense space on your desk.
Yep.
But then they introduce a fatal flaw that essentially ruins the entire visual experience.
Oh, completely.
They rigidly fix the angle of the display into the plastic chassis. You cannot tilt it up or down even a fraction of an inch.
And this really exposes the critical difference between modern screens and 1984 LCD technology. Today, we're accustomed to emissive screens, OLEDs, and backlit LEDs that generate their own light.
Right, they glow in the dark.
Exactly. But early LCDs were entirely reflective. They possessed absolutely no backlight. The polarizing layers inside the screen solely relied on ambient room light passing through the liquid crystals and bouncing off a reflective mirror layer at the very back of the panel.
Which creates a total nightmare scenario for the user. Because if the LCD relies entirely on reflecting ambient light, and they glued it into a fixed vertical position, does that mean the only way to adjust for glare is to physically pick up the entire computer and turn it?
That's exactly what it means. You are at the absolute mercy of your environment. If you are in a dimly lit office, the screen is essentially black. If you're in a bright office with overhead fluorescent lights, that fixed angle might perfectly catch the reflection of the light bulbs, completely washing out your text with this nasty glare.
But why design it that way? Other manufacturers who used early LCDs knew about the glare problem, and their solution was simple. They put the screen on a hinge.
Right, like a normal laptop today.
Yeah. Why would ACT go through the trouble of custom designing controller chips only to rigidly lock the screen in place so the user has to constantly rearrange their desk lamps just to read their own typing?
It really comes down to chassis rigidity and, frankly, just flawed assumptions about user behavior.
How so?
Well, adding a hinge in 1984 meant routing delicate flat ribbon cables through a moving joint, which introduces a major point of mechanical failure and drives up manufacturing costs.
Okay, that makes sense from a cost perspective.
But more importantly, ACT assumed this machine would primarily be used with a base station. They fully expected that when you were at your main desk, you would purchase and plug in their optional external color CRT monitor.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the built-in LCD was viewed almost as a backup display for when you were on the road.
So their engineering solution to our portable screen is incredibly hard to read. Is essentially, well, just buy a heavy non-portable television to plug it into.
Pretty much.
That is infuriating.
It is. I mean, they did try to mitigate it slightly with software. You could hold down the shift key and press the up or down arrows to alter the electrical contrast of the liquid crystals.
Did that help?
Not really. As Bright explicitly points out in his review, no amount of contrast adjustment fixes a fundamentally bad viewing angle. He wrote that the display quality could be appalling or acceptable depending entirely on how carefully you position the entire computer on the desk.
So let's review. Because of the power draw, you are tethered to the wall. Because of the fixed screen, you have to physically rotate the entire machine just to dodge the glare from the window.
Oh.
The physical ergonomics are just atrocious.
It's a textbook example of how solving one bottleneck in early technology almost always exposes or creates another. They solved the problem of a massive, heavy CRP tube, but introduced a total dependence on perfect ambient lighting.
Well, the ergonomics of the main unit were a mess, but ACC clearly knew that because they decided to innovate heavily on the one part of the computer you actually touch.
Yeah.
If they couldn't cut the power cord, they were determined to cut the cords connecting your hands to the machine. Let's look at the input devices, because this is where the Apricot Portable tries to get extremely clever and arguably makes the user experience much, much worse.
You're talking about the infrared link.
Yes, the keyboard. It is a 92-key membrane keyboard, complete with 10 function keys and a full numeric keypad. But there is no coiled rubber cable connecting it to the front of the computer.
Nope.
Instead, it communicates via an invisible infrared light beam. Every single time you press a key, it fires a 32-bit key code across your desk to a receiver on the main unit.
And, from a pure transmission standpoint, the technology was actually remarkably robust. Bright noted in his testing that the infrared link never missed a beat. The 32-bit transmission was highly reliable, and it never dropped or mistranslated a keystroke.
So the invisible laser beam worked perfectly.
It did.
But the actual physical keys you were pressing, that is a completely different story. Bright absolutely hated typing on this thing, didn't he?
He had a miserable time with it. ACT chose to use a membrane keyboard. In the early 80s, membrane keyboards were briefly trendy because they looked very sleek, they were incredibly cheap to manufacture, and they were somewhat spill-resistant.
Right.
But instead of individual mechanical switches with springs, you have flat layers of mylar plastic with conductive traces printed on them. When you press a key, you are just squishing two plastic sheets together to complete an electrical circuit.
Which means there is absolutely zero tactile feedback. You don't get that satisfying mechanical click or physical resistance that tells your brain, yes, the letter has been typed.
None at all.
For a touch typist, it is like drumming your fingers on a kitchen countertop.
It completely destroys typing speed. But ACT made it even worse with a really baffling design choice regarding the spacebar.
Oh, this part is wild.
Yeah. Bright points out that the spacebar didn't actually actuate and register a keystroke until it was pushed down below the level of the surrounding plastic casing.
That sounds physically painful. Imagine you are touch typing an extensive document, right? Your thumbs are naturally hovering over the spacebar. But to actually insert a space, you have to consciously dig your thumb down into a plastic trench.
It's terrible. Bright actually wrote that the design gives your thumb, quote, a very hard time. It completely disrupts the flow of typing.
And the keyboard wasn't the only wireless input device. The machine was designed to ship with an infrared mouse as well, right?
Yes. It was a rather large mouse and trackball hybrid that used the exact same invisible light beam technology to talk to the computer.
So how did the wireless mouse fare in the PCW review?
It didn't.
Not at all.
Nope. The pre-production infrared mouse was completely dead on arrival. Bright Riley noted in the review that the mouse wasn't feeling well and refused to work. He actually joked that it had to go to the vet.
I love that. It's such a brilliantly dry 1980s British tech journalism way of saying the proprietary hardware is totally busted.
Very British, yes.
But he still had to review the graphical software. So how did he navigate the machine without the mouse?
Well, this is where ACT's adherence to industry standards inadvertently saved them from their own proprietary failures. Bright simply grabbed a standard Microsoft serial mouse, plugged it directly into the RS-232 port on the back of the Apricot Portable, and it worked flawlessly.
Wait, I want to pause on that because
Yeah.
that feels significant. A Microsoft mouse just worked out of the box on an ACT machine in 1984.
Yes.
What is an RS-232 port, and why did it save the review?
So RS-232 stands for Recommended Standard 232. It is an incredibly old standard for serial communication that actually dates back to the early 1960s for connecting teletypewriters to modems.
Okay.
By 1984, it had become the universal language for connecting peripherals to microcomputers. It was essentially the USB port of its day. ACT could have locked down their machine and forced you to only use their proprietary infrared accessories, but by including a standard RS-232 port, they gave the user a universal escape patch.
And the software actually knew what to do with it.
Yes, because the Apricot Portable used Digital Research's GSX graphics extension. GSX was basically an abstraction layer designed specifically to standardize graphics applications across wildly different hardware setups.
Ah, I see.
Because all the necessary software drivers for a standard serial mouse were already buried in the GSX layer, the Apricot instantly recognized the Microsoft mouse, bypassing the broken infrared hardware entirely.
Thank goodness for universal standards. But taking a step back, you look at this desk setup. You have an infrared keyboard that gives you thumb cramps, and a wireless mouse that had to go to the vet.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder, Is this the ultimate 1984 example of innovation for innovation's sake?
Hmm.
I mean, what problem were they actually solving by cutting the keyboard wire? The keyboard is always going to be sitting right in front of the screen anyway.
That is the exact conclusion Bright reaches. He explicitly states in the review that he is still trying to think of the actual advantages of an infrared link as opposed to a, quote, good old cable.
Right.
If you are sitting 24 inches away from a tiny 9-inch screen, what does an invisible light beam actually achieve, other than adding cost and complexity?
It feels like a panic move to stand out.
And that is a very astute way to look at the 1984 microcomputing market. It was an absolute bloodbath out there. You had IBM dominating the corporate space, Apple launching the Macintosh, Commodore and Tandy owning the home market, and dozens of smaller manufacturers like ACT fighting for scraps.
Just clawing for any market share.
Exactly. The pressure to differentiate your product was immense. In that panic, manufacturers often prioritize flashy bells and whistles over basic ergonomic utility. An invisible infrared light beam sounds like the future on a marketing brochure. A comfortable spacebar does not.
The brochure sells the sci-fi sizzle, not the thumb cramps.
Exactly.
Okay, but if the infrared keyboard was a marketing gimmick, it pales in comparison to the machine's true flagship feature. The one thing that was supposed to fundamentally change human-computer interaction forever.
Ah, yes. We have arrived at the speech recognition.
Yes. The ACT Apricot Portable claimed to have built-in voice recognition as standard. You could literally talk to your computer to execute commands. That is a wildly ambitious feature to include on a portable machine 40 years ago.
It was almost unheard of on a microcomputer in this price bracket. At the time, if you wanted speech recognition, it generally required a dedicated, highly expensive expansion card filled with specialized hardware just to sample and process the incoming analog audio signal.
And they couldn't fit that in the portable box.
Right. ACT couldn't afford to put that kind of hardware inside a portable chassis, so they took a completely different approach. They relied on highly complex algorithms built directly into the software to do the heavy lifting, using the 8086 processor to analyze the audio patterns.
Which is incredibly clever from a cost-saving perspective, but how did it actually perform? Because I use modern voice assistants today, backed by billion-dollar server farms, and half the time they can't figure out what song I'm asking them to play.
Oh, I know.
I cannot imagine what local CPU-driven voice recognition looked like in 1984.
It was a very manual, highly restrictive process. The voice system allowed you to maintain a vocabulary file of up to 4,096 distinct words.
Wait, that actually sounds like a massive vocabulary for the era.
It sounds impressive until you run headfirst into the RAM limitations we discussed earlier.
Ah, the 256K.
Exactly. Because the onboard memory was so limited, the system could only hold a maximum of 64 words in active RAM at any single time.
Oh, so if you are working and the command you want to speak isn't in that specific block of 64 active words, what happens?
The machine has to constantly shuffle data back and forth from the floppy disk to swap out the vocabulary blocks.
Oh, that sounds excruciating.
It is. If you wanted to utilize a large dictionary of commands, you are going to be doing a massive amount of disk swapping, which completely destroys the seamless, hands-free illusion of voice control.
But before you can even run into the RAM limit, you have to train the machine, right? Because there was no cloud data, it didn't know what English sounded like, it only knew what you sounded like.
Exactly. You had to teach it your specific phonetic footprint. The process involved creating a dedicated file on your floppy disk with a VOC extension. You would manually type in the word you wanted to assign, and then the machine would enter training mode. You would speak the word into the microphone, and the software would record the analog waveform, digitize it, and save the pattern. The documentation suggested repeating the word multiple times so the algorithm could build a more accurate average of your voice.
Okay, so Peter Bright sets this up in his office. He creates his VOC file. How does he decide to test the ultimate computer of the future?
He decides to teach the Apricot Portable the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb.
A classic baseline test. Simple, distinct, single-syllable words. How did the algorithm handle it?
It struggled. Bright noted that the system consistently had problems distinguishing between the word had and the word and.
Mary and a Little Lamb. So it's failing on basic phonetics.
Yep.
But reading the review, the algorithm wasn't actually the biggest point of failure. The physical hardware struck again, didn't it?
Yes, it did. The acoustic input was entirely reliant on an incredibly cheap electric-type microphone supplied by ACT. It was the tiny plastic nub that you could clip to the front of the computer unit or hold in your hand.
And for context, an electret microphone uses a permanently charged dielectric material next to a diaphragm.
Right.
When sound waves hit the diaphragm, it changes the capacitance, creating an electrical signal.
Right.
They're very cheap to produce, but in 1984, they were not known for high fidelity or noise cancellation.
Not at all. The sensitivity of the supplied microphone was absolutely atrocious. Bright writes in the review that to get the machine to actually register the audio signal above the ambient noise of the room, he had to, quote, virtually swallow it.
I want to paint a picture of this for the listener because the human element here completely breaks the technology. Imagine you are Peter Bright. You're leaning awkwardly over this fixed-angle LCD screen, getting window glare right in your eyes. Your thumb is throbbing from the membrane keyboard trench, and you are holding this cheap plastic microphone practically inside your mouth, shouting, "Hey, hey," at a floppy disk drive.
And that physical frustration directly causes the software to fail.
Wait, really?
Yeah, Bright notes a fascinating acoustic phenomenon here. Because he was straining to hold the microphone so close and forcing himself to speak loudly and clearly, it induced stress into his voice.
Ah, and when human vocal cords tighten under stress or frustration, the fundamental pitch and cadence of your voice shift.
Exactly. The stressed audio waveform you are producing in that moment no longer matches the calm, quiet baseline files you recorded during the initial training session.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Right. The 8086 processor is just doing raw mathematical comparisons of the waveforms. If the math doesn't match, it rejects the word. Because of the stress induced by the terrible microphone, the accuracy plummeted. Bright reckoned the machine was only achieving about 80 to 90% accuracy in real-world use.
Which, if you are grading a high school history paper, sounds like a solid B-. But in the realm of computing and command line execution, an 80% accuracy rate is genuinely terrifying.
Very terrifying.
Imagine if your modern smart speaker required you to essentially eat the device just to set a kitchen timer. And because you were stressed out while eating the speaker, it misunderstood you and accidentally ordered 40 pounds of dog food instead.
It's a perfect analogy because the consequences of voice command errors in MS-DOS are severe. ACT's voice recognition didn't have any contextual understanding. In its simplest form, the software just took the word it thought it heard and dumped the text characters directly into the keyboard buffer.
Wait, it just injected the letters as if you had typed them on the keyboard?
Yes, the computer literally thought you had pressed the keys. So if you were sitting at the command prompt and it mishears your voice command, it immediately executes whatever command it thinks you said.
And Bright spells out exactly why this is a nightmare scenario for any professional user.
He does. He wrote, "I would hate dir to be interpreted as format."
Oh, wow. Yeah. For anyone who hasn't used MS-DOS, typing dir just lists the files in your current directory. It is completely safe. The format entirely erases the disk and destroys all your data.
Yes. If the computer mishears a single syllable, it wipes out your entire week's worth of work. ACT claimed in their promotional materials that they were aiming for a 99% accuracy rate in the final production versions of the software.
Did anyone believe that?
Not Bright. After his experience of having to scream into the electric mic, he was highly skeptical they could ever achieve that kind of reliability.
It is just a staggering list of physical compromises. We have a heavy heat sink instead of a battery, a screen you can't tilt to avoid glare, a wireless keyboard that hurts your hands, a dead mouse, and a microphone you have to swallow that might accidentally delete all your files if you sound too stressed out. Was anything on this machine actually functional?
Surprisingly, yes.
Really?
Yes. And this is where the story of the Apricot Portable takes a fascinating turn. It transitions from being a hardware cautionary tale into a genuinely brilliant, forward-thinking piece of software history, because the software interface ACT designed was light years ahead of the physical hardware it was actually running on.
Okay, let's look at the software architecture then, because the dichotomy here is wild. The machine shipped fundamentally running Microsoft's MS-DOS 2.11, right?
Yeah.
Which, at its core, is a completely text-based command line operating system. It is about as user-unfriendly as you can get.
It is incredibly rigid. In standard DOS, you are just staring at a blinking prompt, expected to type perfectly memorized syntax just to navigate directories. But ACT's software engineering team clearly understood that the future of computing lay in approachability.
Okay.
They did not want their users staring at a C prompt, so they heavily masked MS-DOS behind their own custom graphical front-end user interface, which they called Activity.
Activity. And how did Activity function compared to the raw DOS command line?
It was deeply influenced by the Apple Macintosh, which, it's worth noting, had just launched earlier that very same year in 1984.
Oh, perfect timing.
Right. Activity was entirely graphic and icon-based, or, as ACT chose to quirkily spell it in their documentation, IKON icons.
Because it's the 1980s,
Yeah.
and replacing a C with a K is the easiest way to make something sound like it came from the year 2000, Mortal Kombat rules.
Exactly. The visual layout of Activity was remarkably intuitive. When you booted the machine, the majority of the screen was taken up by a list of files residing on the current floppy disk. But to the left of that text list, the software rendered actual graphical pictures of filing cabinet drawers. Those drawers represented your subdirectories. Below the file list, there was a row of graphical icons representing commands, an icon for renaming files, a dustbin icon for deleting them, and icons for creating new directories.
So they successfully mapped a Mac-style drag-and-drop graphical user interface on top of a rigidly text-based DOS architecture running on an 8086 processor. From a pure software engineering standpoint, that is incredibly impressive.
It was brilliantly executed. To interact with a file, you didn't have to type out its full path name. You could just use the arrow keys or the mouse, once Bright plugged in the Microsoft one, to highlight the file. To perform an operation, you simply drag the file over to the desired icon.
Very Mac-like.
Very. Bright noted that the interface was so comprehensive that the only times he ever had to drop down into the raw MS-DOS command line were to use the type command to read a text file or to copy a file into a subdirectory, which was just a minor bug in his pre-production software build.
But the feature of Activity that really blew my mind reading through Bright's review, because it is a UI paradigm we still use versions of today, is how they handled user onboarding. The context-sensitive help system.
Yes. This was a stroke of absolute user interface genius. At the top of the activity screen, there was a persistent help mark. If you were confused about what a button did, you navigated up and selected the help mark. When you did that, the software physically attached a small graphical box directly to the end of your cursor arrow.
It literally glues a tooltip to your mouse pointer.
Exactly. You then move that little box over to whatever specific icon or area of the screen you're having trouble understanding. You click on it, and the system dynamically generates a tailored specific help message explaining exactly what that one item does.
That is so profoundly intuitive. If you don't know what the dustbin is, you grab the help box, drop it on the dustbin, and a pop-up says, dropping files here deletes them.
Right. It's that simple.
You don't have to open a massive text-heavy manual or navigate away from your workspace. And if the tooltips weren't enough, the review mentions a fully interactive self-teach program too.
Right. If you needed a broader understanding of the system, you could position the cursor over the main help icon and press the action button twice. The activity interface would fade out, and you would be dropped seamlessly into a fully interactive graphical tutorial that walked you through the basics of the OS.
That's
Bright was incredibly impressed by this. He stated that after just 10 minutes of using the machine, the interface was so straightforward and logical that the help features became entirely unnecessary.
It is such a stark contrast. It's like they transplanted a modern 21st century software brain into a suit of rusty medieval armor. The activity software desperately wants to be user-friendly, helpful, and visually intuitive. But the physical hardware keeps fighting the user at every turn.
It really does.
You want to drag a file to the dustbin, but your thumb is aching from the spacebar trench, your infrared mouse is broken, and the window glare on the fixed LCD makes it hard to see the dustbin in the first place.
It perfectly illustrates how software development and hardware manufacturing often operate on entirely different timelines with entirely different constraints.
Right.
The software engineering team at ACT was visionary. They clearly understood where human-computer interaction was heading over the next decade, but the hardware team was fundamentally shackled by the physical constraints, thermal limitations, and component costs of 1984.
It really is a tale of two vastly different engineering realities. Oh, we should mention the software bundle, because ACT didn't just give you the activity GUI, they packed the disks with utility software.
It was a very generous, business-oriented package. The portable came bundled with Superator for word processing, SuperCalc for spreadsheets, and SuperPlanner for project management. But they also included a fun little utility called the Ikon editor.
Right. What exactly did the Ikon editor let you do?
It was essentially a fairly basic pixel-level painting program. It provided the user with a canvas where they could choose from 6 different brush shapes, 6 different fill patterns, and up to 8 different colors, assuming, of course, you had purchased the optional color CRT monitor.
Naturally.
You could use this program to draw your own custom 8-color icons and then actively assign them to your various application programs. So when you booted up the activity screen, your custom pixel art would represent your software. Bright admitted you could have, quote, hours of endless fun just playing around, designing little pictures.
Deep system personalization and custom pixel art on a business machine in 1984. That is so cool. And there was one more piece of software, right? The electronic diary, which was supposed to be the ultimate showcase for the voice recognition.
Yes, the ACT diary. And this program represents the one moment where the visionary software and the ambitious hardware try to hold hands.
Okay, here we go.
The diary program was specifically coded to integrate seamlessly with the voice recognition system. Visually, it was quite charming. It displayed a graphical picture of an open, physical diary book on the screen and filled the pages with your appointments. The idea was that you could just speak to the computer to flip pages and schedule meetings.
Let me guess, the pre-production curse struck again.
Unfortunately, yes. The specific review version of the ACT Diary program provided to PCW was fundamentally incompatible with the version of the voice training program Bright was using. They were essentially speaking two different languages.
Oh, no.
Consequently, the results when trying to use Hertis commands to navigate the diary were terrible. ACT assured Bright that the final retail versions would be fully compatible, but at the time of publication, he couldn't verify the flagship integration of the machine.
Which perfectly tees up the ultimate question for any consumer who is staring at the Apricot Portable on a store shelf in November of 1984. When you combine the deeply compromised physical hardware, the mains-only power, the fixed LCD, the painful keyboard, with the brilliantly ambitious but slightly buggy software, was this machine actually worth the money?
To accurately answer that, we have to look at the raw numbers, and we have to adjust them for inflation to truly understand the financial gravity of purchasing this computer.
Let's do the math.
In 1984, the base machine, which got you the computer unit, 256K of RAM, the built-in black and white LCD, the bundled software, and the infrared keyboard carried a retail price of £1,695.
Okay, £1,695 in 1984. What does that feel like to a modern wallet? If I'm walking into a store today, what is the equivalent in 2026 money?
Adjusted for inflation, that £1,695 is approximately £7,070 today.
£7,000 for the base model. For a portable computer that instantly dies if you unplug it from the wall and makes you swallow a plastic microphone to use its flagship feature.
And remember, that is just the starting price. Oh, right.
As we discussed, to actually use this machine ergonomically, as ACT intended for daily office work, you needed the upgrades. Adding a color monitor, which gave you a 640 by 256 resolution, and the ability to display up to 8 colors simultaneously, plus the mandatory extra 128K of dedicated video RAM to drive that monitor, and a functional mouse that cost an extra £300 in 1984.
So throw another £12,250 onto the modern pile.
Exactly. So the fully loaded, usable price in 1984 was £1,995. In 2026 money, you're looking at a staggering £8,320.
Over £8,000. So what does this all mean for the user? I mean, paying the equivalent of highly reliable used car for a machine that feels more like a science experiment than a daily driver? Peter Bryant must have had a tough time writing the conclusion for this review.
He genuinely wrestled with it. To contextualize his disappointment, he contrasted the portable directly with ACT's previous machine, the F1. He noted that the F1 was very easy to judge because it was relatively cheap, solidly built, and offered exceptional value as a straightforward small desktop machine.
The Apricot Portable, however, was an entirely different beast. He wrote that while it has considerably more bells and whistles, it, quote, isn't obvious who will want them.
Because if a business is dropping £8,000 in today's money on a single workstation, they demand total reliability. They want a machine that accelerates their workflow, not one that requires them to battle the glare of the sun and double-check every voice command so they don't format their own hard drive.
Precisely. Bright evaluated the major selling points one by one and systematically dismantled their real-world utility.
Starting with the screen.
Yep, the LCD screen. Because it requires mains power to run the 8086 processor, the machine is never going to be used on a train or in a park. He concluded that most users would inevitably do their heavy, day-to-day computing back at their home base, plugged into a traditional color monitor for readability.
Makes sense.
The built-in LCD, he argued, would probably only be used on, quote, occasional forays out of the office to impress clients.
And even then, You are assuming the client has a conveniently located electrical socket in their conference room, and that you can somehow angle the entire computer perfectly away from their overhead fluorescent lights so they can actually see the screen.
Right. It's an incredibly narrow use case. As for the infrared keyboard, he dismissed it entirely as a marketing gimmick that offered no practical advantage over a coiled wire.
Just unnecessary complexity.
And the voice recognition. He acknowledged it was potentially very useful for hands-free environments, but it was entirely dependent on ACT actually achieving that mythical 99% accuracy rate in the final software. Given his frustrating experience of having to scream into a cheap electro microphone, he severely doubted that level of reliability was imminent.
So looking back at this from a historical perspective, is
Yeah.
it fair to call a machine like the Apricot Portable a scam? I mean, they promised the future, charged an absolute fortune, and delivered a deeply flawed, frustrating physical product.
It is definitively not a scam. It is actually the purest definition of what we call the early adopter tax.
Early adopter tax.
Yeah. Bright's final conclusion was incredibly perceptive. He realized that the Apricot Portable wasn't meant to be the final, perfect iteration of computing. He called the machine a statement of intent from ACT. It was a flag planted firmly in the ground. They were showing the rest of the industry what was theoretically possible, even if the execution wasn't perfectly usable yet.
Look at all these incredible concepts we can cram into one box, even if you probably shouldn't buy it yet.
Exactly, and this dynamic connects to the broader history of all technological advancement. Early adopters, the people willing to spend £8,000 on a flawed machine, essentially fund the research and development for the mainstream future.
They're subsidizing the R&D.
Yes. The business executives who bought the Apricot Portable weren't just paying for the plastic casing and the silicon chips. They were paying for the privilege of touching the future before anyone else. They were funding the expensive iteration process that would eventually lead to reliable tech. Bright even mused at the very end of his review, maybe the next machine will be a CMOS machine with a color LCD.
And he was entirely right. Eventually, the industry solved the thermal problems. They invented active matrix color LCDs, they developed low-power CMOS processors, and they refined speech recognition algorithms. But it took companies like ACT taking massive financial risks, releasing these magnificent, deeply flawed stepping stones to pave the way.
Absolutely. The ACT Apricot Portable failed to be truly portable. Its reliance on power-hungry chips necessitated a mains-only power requirement and a massive, heavy heat sink that permanently tied it to the desk. Its daily usability was deeply hindered by a rigidly fixed LCD that demanded perfect lighting and a membrane keyboard that actively fought the user's hands.
But despite all the physical pain points, the software legacy is undeniable. The Mac-inspired Activities UI running on top of DOS, the brilliant context-sensitive help system, the Ikon editor, these were massive leaps forward in making computers approachable for normal people.
They really were.
And even the voice recognition, as primitive and frustrating as it was, proved that hardware companies were already dreaming of a day when we could throw away the keyboard entirely and just talk to our machines. It's a fascinating 8,300-pound relic of tech history.
It is a perfect encapsulated snapshot of exactly where the computing industry was in November of 1984. Bursting with visionary ideas, but constantly colliding with the hard limits of physical reality.
Which leaves us with a much broader concept to ponder. We can sit here today looking back at the Apricot Portable and laugh at the massive heatsink, the missing battery, and the swallowed microphone. But the ambition behind the machine was entirely real, and it laid the invisible groundwork for the lightweight laptops and ubiquitous voice assistants we take completely for granted today. So, it makes you wonder, if a company in 1984 was willing to fail this, boldly charging a small fortune for a machine full of brilliant half-baked ideas just to push the boundaries of human-computer interaction, what deeply flawed, hyper-expensive piece of technology sitting on store shelves today is actually laying the groundwork for the next 40 years of computing?
That is the exact question every tech historian and venture capitalist is trying to answer right now.
Maybe we'll be laughing at our current bulky VR headsets or awkward AI pins when we look back from the year 2066. Until then, keep an eye on your power cables, appreciate your screen hinges, and whatever you do, do not confuse DIR with format.